The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across the marble floors that William had walked countless times before. Today felt different. Everything felt different. He stood in his private study, looking at the letter in his hands for what must have been the 100th time. The royal seal seemed heavier than usual, and the words on the paper blurred as his eyes filled with tears he refused to let fall. Kate found him there, still in the same position she had left him in an hour earlier. Her heart broke seeing her husband so lost, so unlike the confident prince the world knew him to be. She approached slowly, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet. Even after all these years of marriage, she still felt the need to be gentle with him during his darkest moments. "The children are asking for you," she said softly, placing her hand on his shoulder. "George wants to know if you'll help him with his history homework." William didn't look up from the letter. "How do I explain this to them, Kate? How do I tell our children that everything they've known, everything we've built together, is about to change forever?" The letter had arrived 3 days ago, delivered by a messenger who looked as somber as the news he carried. It contained information that would shake the very foundation of the British royal family. Information that could not be ignored, could not be hidden, and could not be undone. The palace had been in chaos ever since, with emergency meetings happening behind closed doors and phone calls that lasted deep into the night. Kate moved to stand beside her husband, looking out at the gardens where their children often played. "We tell them the truth," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her heart. "We tell them that sometimes grown-ups have to make very difficult decisions, and that no matter what happens, we love them more than anything in this world." William finally looked at his wife. Seeing the strength in her eyes that had first drawn him to her all those years ago at university. Kate had never wanted this life. She had never dreamed of being a princess or a future queen. She had wanted a quiet life, perhaps as a photographer or running her own small business. But she had chosen him, chosen this complicated world of duty and protocol, chosen to stand by his side through everything. "The Prime Minister wants to meet with us tomorrow," William said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Along with the Archbishop and the palace advisors. They want to discuss our options." Kate nodded, though they both knew there really weren't any options. The situation was clear, and the path forward, while heartbreaking, was the only one that made sense. They had spent the last 3 days going over every possible alternative, every way they might be able to stay, every loophole or exception that might exist. But there was none. The sound of children's laughter drifted up from the garden, and both William and Kate turned toward the window. George, Charlotte, and Louis were playing with their nanny, completely unaware that their parents' world was falling apart upstairs. Their innocence was both beautiful and heartbreaking to witness. "I keep thinking about my mother," William said suddenly. "About how she felt when she knew she had to leave. About whether she was scared or relieved or both." Kate took his hand in hers, feeling how cold his fingers were despite the warm day. "Your mother made her choice because she loved you and Harry more than her own comfort. She wanted you to have the best life possible, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness. And now we're facing the same choice," William replied. "Choosing between duty to the crown and duty to our family. Between what's expected of us and what's right for our children." The weight of generations of royal tradition pressed down on them both. William had been raised from birth to understand that he would one day be king, that his life was not entirely his own, that duty came before personal desires. Kate had learned these lessons after their marriage, adapting to a world where every action was scrutinized, every word analyzed, every decision weighed against its impact on the monarchy, but this situation was unprecedented. Never before had a future king faced such a choice. Never before had the very survival of the royal family depended on such a personal sacrifice. Kate moved closer to her husband, resting her head against his shoulder. "Do you remember our wedding day?" she asked. "Do you remember what you told me when we were alone for just a moment before the ceremony?" William smiled for the first time in days. "I told you that whatever happened, whatever challenges we faced, we would face them together. That nothing could break us as long as we had each other. And I believed you then," Kate said. I believe you now. Outside, the afternoon was growing late. Soon they would need to go downstairs for dinner with the children, to pretend that everything was normal, to maintain the facade that had become second nature to them both. But for now, in this quiet moment in their study, they could simply be William and Kate, a husband and wife facing an impossible situation together. The letter lay forgotten on the desk as they held each other, drawing strength from their connection. Tomorrow would bring meetings and decisions and announcements that would change everything. Tomorrow would begin the process that would tear them away from the only life they had ever known together. But tonight, they still had each other. Tonight, they were still a family living in the palace that had become their home. Tonight, they could still hope that somehow, some way, they would find a path through this darkness that would keep them together as the sun set over London. Painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, William and Kate stood at their window, looking out at the city that would soon learn their story. Neither of them spoke, but both understood that they were saying goodbye to more than just their royal duties. They were saying goodbye to the future they had planned, the dreams they had shared, and the certainty that had always defined their lives. The silence between them was not empty, but full of all the words they couldn't yet say, all the tears they couldn't yet shed, and all the love that would have to sustain them through whatever came next. The conference room at Buckingham Palace had never felt so cold, despite the warm spring weather outside. William sat at the mahogany table that had witnessed countless royal decisions throughout history, his hands folded in front of him as he tried to maintain his composure. Kate sat beside him, her back straight and her face calm, though William could see the tension in the way she held her shoulders. Across from them sat the Prime Minister, a woman whose usually confident demeanor seemed strained. To her left was the Archbishop of Canterbury, his weathered hands clasped in prayer position, while the palace's most senior advisors filled the remaining seats around the table. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of the decision they all knew had to be made. Your Royal Highness, the Prime Minister began, her voice carefully measured, we've reviewed every possible alternative. The legal team has examined precedents. The constitutional experts have consulted historical documents, and the public relations team has considered every angle. Unfortunately, our conclusion remains the same. William nodded slowly. He had expected as much, but hearing it said aloud still felt like a physical blow. How long do we have? He asked. The announcement will need to be made within the month, replied Sir Edmund, the palace's most senior advisor. The longer we wait, the more likely it is that the information will leak to the press. We need to control the narrative. Kate spoke for the first time since entering the room. And our children? What provisions will be made for them? They will retain their titles and their place in the line of succession, the Archbishop assured her. This decision, while unprecedented, does not affect their royal status. They will continue to be protected and supported by the crown. William felt a mixture of relief and heartbreak. Relief that his children would be safe and cared for, heartbreak that he might not be the one doing the caring. Where will we go? He asked quietly. The question hung in the air for a moment before the Prime Minister responded. That will be entirely your choice, Your Royal Highness. The Queen has made it clear that while you cannot remain in your current roles, you will always be family. Financial provisions will be made to ensure your comfort and security wherever you choose to settle. William thought of his grandmother, the Queen, and how difficult this conversation must have been for her. At 97, she had seen the monarchy survive 2 world wars, countless scandals, and decades of social change. Now she was being asked to let go of her beloved grandson and his family to protect the institution she had devoted her life to. Serving has Her Majesty expressed any personal wishes regarding our destination? Kate asked. Sir Edmund cleared his throat. Her Majesty mentioned that perhaps somewhere with strong Commonwealth ties would be appropriate. Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Somewhere you could maintain some connection to the crown while building new lives. The thought of starting over in a foreign country, even a Commonwealth nation, felt overwhelming to both William and Kate. They had spent their entire married life in England. Their children had been born here, their friends and extended family were here. The idea of leaving everything behind seemed impossible. "What about our charitable work?" William asked. "The foundations we've established, the causes we've championed?" "Those will need to be transitioned to other members of the royal family," the Prime Minister replied gently. "Your brother Harry, perhaps, or Princess Anne. The important work will continue, just under different leadership." William felt another piece of his heart break. The mental health advocacy, the conservation efforts, the work with veterans, these causes had given his royal life meaning beyond the ceremonial duties. To lose not just his title, but his ability to make a difference felt like losing his identity entirely. Kate reached over and took his hand under the table, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the others in the room. Her touch reminded him that while he was losing his role as a prince, he was not losing what mattered most: his family. "Timeline," Kate said simply, her voice steady. "We need to know exactly how this will unfold." Sir Edmund opened a thick folder. "We propose making the announcement in 3 weeks. This will give us time to prepare the public, brief the media, and ensure all legal documents are in order. You'll have a period of transition, perhaps 6 months, to conclude your current commitments and prepare for relocation." "And during this transition period?" William asked. "You'll remain in residence at Kensington Palace, but public appearances will be minimal. We'll gradually reduce your official duties and begin transferring your patronages. The goal is to make the transition as smooth as possible for both the family and the institution." The Archbishop leaned forward. "I want you both to know that this decision, while difficult, is being made with the future of the monarchy in mind. Sometimes the greatest act of service is stepping aside to allow the institution to continue thriving." William looked at the man who had officiated his wedding, who had christened his children, who had been a source of spiritual guidance throughout his adult life. "Will we ever be able to return?" he asked. The silence that followed was answer enough. This wasn't a temporary exile or a sabbatical. This was goodbye. Kate squeezed William's hand tighter. "We'll need time to tell the children ourselves before any announcement is made." "Of course," the Prime Minister agreed. "We understand this is particularly difficult given their ages. Perhaps professional counseling could be arranged to help them process the changes." "We'll handle our children ourselves," William said firmly, his royal authority showing through despite everything. They deserve to hear this from their parents, in their own home, in their own time. After another hour of discussing logistics, legal requirements, and public messaging, the meeting began to wind down. As the advisors and officials gathered their papers and prepared to leave, William and Kate remained seated, neither quite ready to stand up and face the reality waiting outside the conference room. "Your Royal Highness," Sir Edmund said quietly as the others filed out, "for what it's worth, you're making the right choice. History will remember your sacrifice." William looked up at the man who had served his family for over 30 years. "Will it matter what history remembers if my children grow up feeling abandoned by their father?" "Your children will grow up knowing their father chose them over everything else in the world," Sir Edmund replied. "That's a legacy any child would be proud of." As the last advisor left the room, William and Kate found themselves alone with the enormity of what had just been decided. In 3 weeks, their life as they knew it would be over. In 6 months, they would be living in a foreign country, trying to build new identities while helping their children understand why their world had been turned upside down. But as William looked at his wife, he realized that while they were losing everything else, they still had each other. And perhaps, in the end, that would be enough to build something new from the ashes of their old life. The children's playroom at Kensington Palace had always been William and Kate's favorite room in their home. Unlike the formal sitting rooms and grand dining halls, this space belonged entirely to their family. Toys scattered across the floor, artwork hung on the walls at child height, and comfortable cushions created cozy reading nooks where they had spent countless hours together. Now, as William and Kate prepared to have the most difficult conversation of their lives, the room felt both comforting and heartbreaking. George, at 10 years old, was sprawled on the carpet working on a puzzle of the London skyline. Charlotte, 8, was carefully arranging her collection of horse figurines in what she called a royal parade. Little Louis, only 5, was building an elaborate castle with his blocks. Completely absorbed in his creation, Kate sat down on the floor beside George, while William settled into the armchair where he often read bedtime stories. The normalcy of the scene made what they were about to do even more difficult. "Children," Kate said gently, "Daddy and I need to talk to you about something very important." George looked up from his puzzle, immediately sensing the serious tone in his mother's voice. Charlotte stopped arranging her horses, and even Louis paused in his building to look at his parents. The children had learned to read their parents' moods with the precision that came from living in a household where unspoken tensions were often the loudest communications. "Are we in trouble?" Charlotte asked, her voice small. "No, sweetheart," William said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're not in trouble. You 3 are the most wonderful children any parents could ask for." George, being the oldest, was the first to pick up on the underlying sadness in the room. "Is someone sick?" he asked, remembering how quiet the adults had become when great-grandpapa Philip had been unwell. "No one is sick," Kate assured him. "But there have been some changes, some very big decisions that affect our whole family." William leaned forward in his chair, meeting each of his children's eyes. "You know how sometimes grown-ups have to make choices that are very hard, choices that they don't want to make but have to make anyway?" The children nodded, though William could see confusion growing in their expressions. Louis abandoned his blocks entirely and moved to sit closer to his mother, sensing that something was very wrong even if he couldn't understand what. "Well," Kate continued, "Daddy and I have had to make one of those choices. A choice about our family and about the jobs we do." "What kind of choice?" George asked, his 10-year-old mind already working to understand the implications of his parents' careful words. William took a deep breath. "You know how Daddy's job is being a prince, and how that means we live here in the palace and go to important events and meet with lots of people? And how Mummy is going to be a queen someday," Charlotte added, proud of her understanding of her family's unique situation. "Yes," Kate said softly. "But sometimes, even with very important jobs like ours, situations happen that mean people have to stop doing those jobs." George's eyes widened. "You mean you're not going to be a prince anymore, Daddy?" The directness of the question hit William like a physical blow. "That's right, George. Daddy won't be a prince anymore, and Mummy won't become a queen." Louis, who didn't fully understand what being a prince meant beyond living in a big house and having lots of people want to take their picture, focused on the practical implications. "Does that mean we have to move away from our house?" "Yes, little one," Kate said, pulling Louis into her lap. "It means we'll be moving to a new house in a new place." The silence that followed was deafening. George stared at his parents as if they had suddenly become strangers. Charlotte's lower lip began to tremble, and Louis looked from his mother to his father as if expecting one of them to suddenly laugh and tell him it was all a joke. "But why?" George finally asked, his voice breaking slightly. "Did we do something wrong? Did Daddy do something wrong?" "No," William said firmly, moving from his chair to sit on the floor with his children. "None of us did anything wrong. Sometimes in life, especially in our kind of life, situations happen that are beyond anyone's control. Sometimes people have to make sacrifices to protect the people they love most. What's a sacrifice?" Louis asked, the word unfamiliar to him. "A sacrifice," Kate explained, "is when you give up something important to you to help someone else or to do what's right." Charlotte had been unusually quiet, but now she looked up at her parents with tears in her eyes. "Are you sacrificing being a prince and princess for us?" The question was so perceptive, so exactly right, that both William and Kate felt their carefully maintained composure begin to crack. "In a way, yes," William said honestly. "Sometimes being good parents means making choices that are hard but necessary. Will we still be a family?" George asked the question that had been worrying him most. "Oh, sweetheart," Kate said, reaching out to pull all 3 children close. "We will always, always be a family. Moving away from the palace doesn't change that we're your mummy and daddy and that we love you more than all the stars in the sky, But what about our friends? Charlotte asked. What about our school? What about Granny and Grandpa? These were the questions William and Kate had been dreading because they didn't have good answers. We'll visit with Granny and Grandpa as often as we can, William said. And your friends will always be your friends, even if we're far away. And you'll make new friends in our new home. Where is our new home going to be? George asked. We don't know yet, Kate admitted. We're still deciding. But wherever it is, it will be somewhere beautiful, somewhere we can all be together and be happy. Louis, with the resilience of a 5-year-old, had already begun to adapt to the idea. Will our new house have a garden? Can I still have my bicycle? Yes and yes, William said, managing to smile for the first time in the conversation. Any house we choose will have room for bicycles and gardens and all the things you love. Charlotte, however, was struggling more. I don't want to leave, she said quietly. This is our home. I don't want a new home. Kate's heart broke as she looked at her daughter's face. I know, my darling. Change is scary, especially when it's not what we chose. But sometimes the best adventures start with the scariest changes. When do we have to leave? George asked, his practical nature asserting itself. Not for a while yet, William said. We have time to get ready, time to say proper goodbyes, time to help you prepare for our new adventure. The children sat in contemplative silence for several minutes, processing information that was beyond their years to fully understand. Finally, George spoke up again. Daddy, will you still be my daddy even if you're not a prince? William felt tears he had been holding back for days finally begin to fall. George, I will be your daddy forever and always, no matter what titles I have or don't have. Being your father is the most important job I'll ever have. And Mummy will still be our Mummy? Louis asked. Forever and always, Kate confirmed, kissing the top of his head as the afternoon wore on. The children asked more questions, some of which William and Kate could answer. Others they couldn't, but slowly, gradually, the initial shock began to give way to a cautious acceptance. The children didn't understand all the implications of what was happening, but they understood that their parents loved them and that their family would remain intact. That evening, as William and Kate tucked each child into bed, they were amazed by their resilience. Children, they realized, were far more adaptable than adults. While William and Kate saw only loss and upheaval, their children were already beginning to imagine the possibilities that lay ahead. The news broke on a Tuesday morning at precisely 9 o'clock, just as the palace communications team had planned. William stood in his study watching the BBC newsreader announce to the world what he had known for weeks would come. The carefully worded statement spoke of personal circumstances requiring a step back from royal duties, and a mutual decision made with the full support of Her Majesty the Queen. But William knew the truth was far more complicated than the sanitized version being presented to the public. He turned away from the television as Kate entered the room, her face pale but composed. They had both known this moment would come, but seeing their private pain become public news still felt surreal. How are the children? William asked, though he could hear them in the next room, their laughter a stark contrast to the somber mood that had settled over the palace. They're remarkably calm, Kate replied, settling into the chair beside his desk. George asked if he should tell his teacher today, and Charlotte wanted to know if she could bring her horses with her when we move. They're processing this better than we are. Outside, William could already hear the sound of camera crews setting up on the street. By noon, there would be dozens of reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers gathered at the palace gates. The story would dominate headlines around the world, sparking debates about duty, family, and the future of the monarchy. William's private secretary knocked quietly on the door before entering with a tablet full of news alerts and social media updates. Sir, the initial reaction has been mixed, as expected. There's considerable support for your decision, but also significant criticism. The palace suggests avoiding social media for the next several days. Kate nodded, having anticipated this response. The public had strong opinions about the royal family. and their decision to step back would be debated endlessly by people who knew nothing about the real circumstances behind their choice? Any word from my father? William asked. His Royal Highness King Charles has asked to see you both this afternoon, if you're available. The secretary replied carefully. William and Kate exchanged glances. Charles had been notably absent during the discussions leading up to this announcement, and William wasn't sure if his father's silence indicated support or disappointment. The morning passed in a blur of phone calls, meetings, and legal consultations. Lawyers arrived to discuss the transfer of William's royal duties and patronages. Charitable organizations that had relied on William and Kate's support needed to be informed personally before they read about the changes in the newspapers. Each conversation was a small goodbye, another thread connecting them to their old life being carefully cut. Around lunchtime, Harry called from California. Despite their complicated relationship in recent years, William felt a rush of gratitude hearing his brother's voice. "I've been thinking about you both all morning," Harry said without preamble. "I know this wasn't an easy decision." "It was the only decision," William replied simply. "I know," Harry said quietly. "And for what it's worth, I think you're incredibly brave. Both of you." The conversation was brief but meaningful. Harry offered practical advice about adjusting to life outside the royal bubble, warned about the media attention that would follow, and promised his support in whatever way he could provide it. When William hung up the phone, he felt less alone than he had in weeks. The afternoon meeting with King Charles took place in the same room where William had first learned about the circumstances that led to this moment. His father sat behind the same desk where his own mother, Queen Elizabeth, had conducted royal business for over 70 years. The weight of history and tradition was palpable in the room. "William," Charles began, his voice formal but tinged with emotion, "I want you to know that this decision, while unprecedented, has my complete support." William felt a relief he hadn't realized he needed. "Thank you, Papa. That means more to me than I can express." "Your mother would be proud of you," Charles continued, referring to Diana. "She always said that being a good father was more important than being a good prince." Kate felt tears welling up in her eyes. The comparison to Diana, who had made her own difficult choices to protect her children, felt both heartbreaking and validating. Charles stood and moved to the window overlooking the palace gardens. "I've spent my entire life preparing to be king, understanding that duty must come before personal desires. But watching what you and Kate have faced these past weeks, I've begun to question whether we've expected too much from our family in the name of service." "The monarchy will survive this," William said quietly. "It survived far worse challenges throughout history." "Yes," Charles agreed. "But at what cost? And is that cost worth paying if it means losing what matters most?" The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical matters like security arrangements and financial provisions, but also touching on deeper questions about family, duty, and legacy. By the time William and Kate left Charles's office, they felt they had not just their father's permission to leave, but his blessing that evening as they put the children to bed. The full reality of their situation began to sink in. In a few months, they would no longer tuck their children into beds at Kensington Palace. They would no longer be their royal highnesses. They would simply be William and Kate, parents trying to give their children the best life possible under extraordinary circumstances. "Are you scared?" Kate asked as they prepared for bed themselves. William considered the question seriously. "Terrified," he admitted, "but also relieved. For the first time in my adult life, I feel like I'm making a choice that's entirely my own." Kate nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Their entire married life had been shaped by expectations, protocols, and duties determined by others. Now, for better or worse, they were about to write their own story. As they lay in bed that night, listening to the distant sounds of London outside their window, William and Kate held each other close. Tomorrow would bring more meetings, more decisions, and more steps toward their new life. But tonight, they were still home, still together, still finding strength in each other as they had since the very beginning. The announcement had been made, the die was cast, and there was no turning back. But as William felt Kate's breathing slow beside him as she fell asleep, he realized that despite everything they were giving up, they were also gaining something precious, the chance to put their family first, to make decisions based on love rather than duty, and to show their children that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose your own path. Outside, the media circus continued. But inside their bedroom, there was finally peace. The hardest part was over. The announcement had been made, and the world now knew what William and Kate had been carrying in their hearts for weeks. Tomorrow they would begin the process of building their new life. But tonight, they could simply rest in the knowledge that they had made the right choice for their family. The removal vans arrived at Kensington Palace on a crisp October morning, their presence marking the beginning of the end of William and Kate's life as working royals. The past 6 months had passed in a whirlwind of preparations, farewells, and the strange process of dismantling a life that had been built around centuries of tradition and expectation. Kate stood in the children's playroom, now mostly empty except for a few boxes of treasured belongings. The walls looked bare without Charlotte's artwork and George's school certificates. The reading corner where she had spent countless hours with bedtime stories was just an empty space with indentations in the carpet where the armchair used to sit. "Mummy, where should this go?" Louis asked, holding up his favorite stuffed elephant, the one that had traveled with him to every royal engagement since he was 2 years old. "That goes in your special carry-on bag," Kate said, kneeling down to his level. "Effie needs to fly with us on the airplane, doesn't he?" Louis nodded seriously. At 6 years old now, he had adapted to the idea of their move with remarkable resilience. To him, it was simply an adventure to a new place where there would be different parks to explore and new friends to make. George appeared in the doorway, looking older than his 11 years. "Dad wants us to come down to the main hall," he said quietly. "Granny is here." Kate's heart skipped. Queen Elizabeth's visit hadn't been on the schedule, but then again, very little about their departure was following normal protocol. She took Louis's hand and followed George downstairs, where she found William standing with his grandmother, in the grand entrance hall where they had posed for so many family photographs over the years. The Queen, now 98 but still sharp and dignified, was dressed in one of her familiar pastel suits, her handbag precisely positioned on her arm. She looked smaller somehow in the vast space of the palace. Or perhaps it was just that Kate was seeing her as a grandmother saying goodbye to her family rather than as the monarch she served. "Catherine, dear," the Queen said warmly, extending her hands, "I wanted to see the children before you left." Charlotte and Louis rushed to their great-grandmother, who embraced them with a tenderness that was rarely seen by the public. George, more aware of the significance of the moment, approached more cautiously but was soon wrapped in the same warm embrace. "Now then," the Queen said, settling herself on one of the chairs that hadn't yet been packed away, "I have something for each of you before you begin your new adventure." She opened her handbag and withdrew 3 small wrapped packages. Each child received a gift chosen specifically for them, a compass for George, "So you'll always find your way home," a small jewelry box with a dancing horse for Charlotte, "to remember that true nobility comes from kindness," and a picture book about a brave little elephant for Louis, "to remind you that the smallest among us can be the strongest." William watched the scene with a mixture of love and heartbreak. His grandmother had been the steadying force in his life since childhood, the person who had taught him about duty and service, but who had also shown him unconditional love. Saying goodbye to her felt like losing his anchor. "William," the Queen said quietly when the children had run off to explore their gifts, "walk with me in the garden." They strolled through the gardens that Kate had lovingly tended during their years at Kensington Palace. The roses she had planted were in their final bloom of the season, and the herb garden she had started with the children still showed signs of their careful attention. "I want you to know," the Queen began, her voice steady but soft, "that what you're doing takes tremendous courage. When I was young, I thought duty meant never choosing personal happiness over royal obligation. But I've lived long enough to understand that sometimes the greatest duty is protecting those we love most. William felt tears threatening. I keep wondering if there was another way, if I could have found a solution that didn't require leaving. There are moments in every life when we face impossible choices, the Queen replied. Your grandfather faced such a choice during the war, your father faced it when your mother died, and now you face yours. The measure of a person isn't whether they face difficult choices, but whether they make them with love and integrity. They paused beside the fountain where William and Kate had often brought the children to feed the ducks. The crown will continue, the Queen continued. It always has, it always will. But families are more fragile. They require active protection, constant nurturing. You're choosing to nurture yours, and that is noble work. When they returned to the house, they found Kate helping the children pack their final personal items. The removal team had been respectful and efficient, but there was something surreal about watching strangers handle possessions that represented years of memories. The Queen spent another hour with them, sharing tea and biscuits while the children chatted about their new school in Vancouver and the house William and Kate had chosen overlooking the harbor. She listened with genuine interest as Charlotte described the horses she hoped to see in the nearby mountains, and George talked about learning to sail in the Pacific waters. When it came time for the Queen to leave, the goodbye was both formal and deeply personal. She embraced each of the children again, whispering something private to each of them that made them smile. She shook hands formally with Kate, but then pulled her into an unexpected hug. Take care of them, she whispered to Kate, and take care of yourself. You're a remarkable woman, and I'm proud to have known you. Her goodbye with William was the most difficult. They stood facing each other in the entrance hall, grandfather and grandson, monarch and subject, but most importantly, two people who loved each other deeply despite the circumstances that were pulling them apart. I love you, Granny, William said simply, and I love you, my dear boy. I always have, I always will, regardless of titles or duties or geography. After the Queen left, the family spent their final afternoon at Kensington Palace quietly. They walked through each room one more time, sharing memories and saying their own private goodbyes. Kate found herself lingering in the kitchen where she had learned to cook William's favorite meals, while William spent extra time in his study, where he had wrestled with so many difficult decisions over the years. That evening, their last dinner at the palace was takeaway fish and chips eaten on the floor of the empty sitting room. The children thought it was great fun to have a picnic inside, while William and Kate marveled at how such a simple meal could feel so perfect in such an imperfect moment. As they put the children to bed in their nearly empty rooms, each parent spent extra time with goodnight stories and reassurances. The children were excited about their flight the next day, about seeing their new home, about starting their adventure. Their resilience and optimism gave William and Kate strength they hadn't known they possessed. Later that night, William and Kate walked through the palace one final time. They visited the nursery where each of their children had taken their first steps, the dining room where they had hosted countless dinners, the sitting room where they had watched their children perform impromptu plays and concerts. Do you regret it? Kate asked as they stood in the doorway of their bedroom. William considered the question seriously. I regret that it came to this. I regret that we couldn't find another way. But I don't regret choosing our family. Then we'll make this work, Kate said with quiet determination. We'll build something beautiful in Canada, something that's entirely ours. As they settled into bed for their last night as residents of Kensington Palace, William and Kate felt a strange mixture of grief and anticipation. Tomorrow would begin their new life, but tonight belonged to memories and quiet gratitude for all the beauty they had experienced within these walls. 2 years later, William stood on the deck of their home overlooking Vancouver's English Bay, watching Louis chase seagulls along the shoreline while Charlotte and George built an elaborate sandcastle. The morning sun painted the water gold, and the mountains in the distance stood majestically against a clear blue sky. The scene was so peaceful, so perfectly ordinary, that it sometimes still surprised him how content he felt. Kate emerged from the house, carrying a tray of hot chocolate and fresh muffins she had baked that morning. Cooking and baking had become one of her greatest pleasures in their new life. simple activities that grounded her in the present moment and gave her a sense of accomplishment. That had nothing to do with public duty or royal protocol. Any word from George's teacher? About the science project? William asked, accepting his mug gratefully. She says he's doing beautifully, Kate replied, settling into the chair beside him. Apparently his presentation on marine conservation was so passionate that 3 other children asked if they could join his research group. William smiled, thinking about his eldest son's transformation over the past 2 years. George had struggled initially with the move, missing his friends and the familiar rhythms of life in London. But gradually he had found his footing in Vancouver, discovering a love for sailing and marine biology that had given him new purpose and confidence. Charlotte had adapted even more quickly, her natural warmth and curiosity serving her well in making new friends. She had joined the local riding club and spent most weekends at the stables, coming home muddy and exhausted but radiating happiness. The shy, sometimes anxious little girl they had left London with had blossomed into a confident, adventurous child who spoke with equal enthusiasm about her horses and her new friends, and Louis, now 7, had embraced their new life with the wholehearted acceptance that seemed to come naturally to him. He had learned to identify birds along the shoreline, could name all the types of boats in the harbor, and had made friends with the elderly man who lived next door and taught him to fish from the pier every Saturday morning. I had an interesting phone call yesterday, Kate said, her tone carefully neutral. Oh? William looked at her with curiosity. From the Vancouver Children's Hospital. They're looking for a new patron for their mental health initiative, Dr. Patterson. The one who spoke at Charlotte's school last month recommended me. William felt a familiar stirring of interest. They had both missed their charitable work more than they had expected. While their new life was fulfilling in many ways, they both felt the absence of the purposeful work that had given their royal duties meaning. What did you tell them? He asked. That I'd think about it, Kate replied. It wouldn't be anything like what we used to do. No grand galas or royal patronage announcements. Just real work with real people, making a real difference. William nodded thoughtfully. Over the past 2 years, they had deliberately kept a low profile, focusing on their family and their adjustment to civilian life. But lately, both of them had been feeling ready to re-engage with the world beyond their immediate circle. I've been thinking about something similar, William admitted. There's a conservation organization here that works with indigenous communities on protecting traditional fishing grounds. They could use someone with experience in environmental advocacy. Kate smiled, recognizing the spark in her husband's eyes that had been dimmed for so long during their final months in London. Look at us, she said. 2 years ago, we thought our meaningful work was over, and here we are ready to dive back in. The difference is choice, William replied. We're choosing what matters to us rather than having it chosen for us. As if summoned by their conversation about the future, George appeared on the deck, sandy and slightly out of breath from his beach adventures. Dad, can we take the boat out this afternoon? There's supposed to be a pod of orcas migrating through the sound today. William grinned at his son's enthusiasm. George's love for sailing had become one of the great joys of their new life. William had taught him to handle their small sailboat, and some of their best conversations happened while they were out on the water together. If the weather holds, William agreed. But homework first. George groaned dramatically but didn't really argue. His adjustment to a regular school, where he was simply George Wales rather than Prince George, had been one of the most positive changes in his life. His teachers saw him as a bright, curious student rather than a future king, and his classmates valued him for his kindness and humor rather than his royal lineage that afternoon. As promised, William and George took the boat out into English Bay. The orcas didn't appear, but they had a wonderful sail anyway, with George handling the tiller with increasing confidence while William managed the sails. As they made their way back to shore, George asked the question that William had been expecting for months. Dad, do you ever miss it? Being a prince, I mean? William considered his answer carefully. I miss some parts of it, he said honestly. I miss being able to draw attention to causes I cared about. I miss working with some of the organizations we supported. But I don't miss the pressure or the constant scrutiny, or the feeling that our family's happiness always came second to duty. George nodded thoughtfully. I used to be angry that we had to leave, he admitted. But I like our life here. I like that when I do well in school, it's because I worked hard, not because I'm supposed to be special. That evening, as they had every Sunday for the past 2 years, the family gathered in their living room for what they called gratitude time. Each person shared something from the week they were grateful for. It had started as Kate's way of helping the children process their emotions during the transition, but it had become a cherished family tradition. Louis went first, as the youngest. I'm grateful that Mrs. Henderson taught me to tie a proper fishing knot, and that I caught 2 fish yesterday even though they were too small to keep, Charlotte followed. I'm grateful that Starlight let me braid her mane yesterday, and that Sarah invited me to her birthday party next weekend. George thought for a moment. I'm grateful that my team won the sailing regatta at school and that Dad has time to come to my competitions now. Kate felt tears prick her eyes at George's last comment. In their old life, royal duties would often have prevented William from attending school events. Here, he never missed anything important to the children. I'm grateful for this house, Kate said, and for the way the morning light comes through the kitchen window, and for the fact that I can walk to the market without anyone taking my picture. Finally, it was William's turn. He looked around at his family, at the cozy living room they had decorated together, at the view of the water through their windows. I'm grateful that we're all here together, he said simply. I'm grateful that we made the hard choice that brought us to this good place. Later that night, after the children were asleep, William and Kate walked hand in hand along the beach near their home. The lights of Vancouver twinkled across the water, and the sound of gentle waves provided a peaceful soundtrack to their conversation. I got a letter from Harry today, William said. He and Megan are thinking of visiting this summer. The cousins could meet their new baby. Kate smiled, pleased by the continued healing in William's relationship with his brother. Distance and shared experience had helped both brothers understand each other better. I'd like that, she said. I think the children would love to show off their new world to their uncle and aunt. As they walked, they passed other families enjoying the mild evening. Children playing on the playground, couples walking their dogs. They were simply part of the community now, no different from any other family who had chosen Vancouver as their home. Do you think we'll ever go back? Kate asked quietly. Not to royal duties, but just to visit, to see family? Someday, William replied. When enough time has passed, when the children are older and can understand everything better. But this is our home now. This is where we belong. As they made their way back to their house, with its cheerful yellow door and the children's bicycles scattered on the front porch, William reflected on the journey that had brought them here. 2 years ago, leaving London had felt like the end of everything. Now he understood it had been the beginning. They had lost titles, duties, and the life they had planned. But they had gained something infinitely more precious, the freedom to be themselves, to raise their children according to their own values, to find work that fulfilled them without the weight of centuries of expectation, standing in his doorway. Looking back at the path that had led them from Kensington Palace to this quiet street in Vancouver, William felt something he hadn't experienced in years, complete peace with his choices. They had made their silent farewell to one life and embraced another, and in doing so they had discovered that love, indeed, was enough to build a new world upon.